in 2003, I began limping, or I had been limping, but a friend of mine noticed it, and I said, yes, actually I am having trouble walking, and it led to a whole series of tests, and finally, I had MRIs and brain scans and lumbar punctures, or otherwise known as spinal taps, and that was at Cedars-Sinai. And then after about 4.5 years there, I kind of lost faith, and I switched over to UCLA, and I had the great good fortune eventually to connect with Dr. Brent Fogel, who I guess had taken an interest in my case. And so after about 7.5 years, I was finally diagnosed with a very rare degenerative condition called adult polyglucosan body disease. And it's kind of shifted my career to where, even though I feel my photography is better than ever, I've stopped being hired. So now I'm living in Miami, Florida, and I'm still doing photography, but I've embarked on a new path where I'm teaching, and I've gotten a fellowship at Florida International University, and just to me, I feel like that's really the higher calling. But at any rate, we're very fortunate today to have here the doctor who diagnosed me, and there's a couple of other patients who have been diagnosed by Dr. Fogel. And Dr. Fogel is going to speak to us about adult polyglucosan body disease and our story. So, Dr. Fogel, are you here?
I'm right here.
Oh, good, okay. So anyway, Dr. Brent Fogel of UCLA.
So I'm a scientist. I'm going to talk a little bit about some science, but what I really mostly want to do is I want to tell a story. And the story that I want to tell is in 3 parts. So the first part, I'm going to start with how Robert and I got to know each other, and you kind of heard a little bit about it. And so the way that came to be is, I believe it was around about 7 years ago. And a colleague of mine came up to me in the hallway and said, I'm really puzzled about something. I've got this gentleman who I'm seeing in my clinic, and a couple of years ago, he started limping, started having some trouble walking. His legs are starting to feel stiff, they're starting to feel weak, he's having trouble with some sensation, and it just seems to be getting worse. And try as we might, we can't figure out what's going on. And then my colleague said to me, is there anything you can think of that we haven't tried yet? And again, as Robert will tell you, if anybody ever asks me that question, the answer is always yes. Okay? I can think of the craziest things. So anyway, so that's how Robert and I met. And my suspicion at that time was that what was going on was in fact genetic. So we started to begin to look for genetic causes. And we looked for the common things. At the time, he had a diagnosis, it was called spastic paraparesis. And essentially that means stiff legs. So we looked for all the common genetic causes, then the less common, then the rare ones, then the very rare ones. And I think by 2009, we'd tested about 36 different genes, all negative. At that time, that was a pretty staggering number of genetic tests to go through. And I was actually starting to get a little bit stumped myself. And that's when I came across an article from researchers in Israel and the Mayo Clinic who described a very unusual case of a woman who was in her 60s, who was having very similar trouble walking. And they had done a muscle biopsy, and there were some very interesting findings on the muscle biopsy. So I called Robert on the phone, I said, you need to come down, we need to do a muscle biopsy. And I'm going to stop there for a second, I'm going to tell the second part of my story. So the second part of my story is taking place right now, in everybody in this room. And the main character of this story is a molecule called glucose. I'm sure everybody has probably heard about glucose at some point. It's in our diet, it's something that we eat all the time. An example of a food that's pretty much pure glucose is corn syrup. Okay? And probably the best name that you know glucose by is blood sugar. Okay? And glucose is a carbohydrate, it's in fact the simplest carbohydrate. And the reason it's so important is because it's the main energy source for all of us, for the entire human body. And so right now I'm burning tons of glucose right now here talking to you. So we need to keep glucose available in our blood all the time. So how do we do that? So yeah, we keep it in our blood, but we have to store it too. And the way we store it is they take all the little tiny molecules of glucose and they stick them together. They form a molecule called glycogen. And if you looked at glycogen under a microscope, it looks like a tree with these long branches but no leaves. And the way you get these branches is by an enzyme that's in our body called glycogen branching enzyme. Very creative name. Anyway, the branches are really important. And the reason they're really important is because they let the glycogen fold up into this tight little package that can stay in our liver and in our muscles, and anytime we need more glucose, you can just break off little pieces of it. And that's what happens every single day when we're doing things. Now, unfortunately, the story takes a turn. And the turn that it takes is that there are some people who are unfortunate enough that their glycogen branching enzyme does not work correctly. So they make glycogen, but the tree doesn't have as many branches. And at first, everything is fine. And you can make glycogen. The glycogen works just fine. But over time, and I'm talking years and decades, what happens is the glycogen starts to solidify in the body. And it forms these chunks, primarily in the nerves, of solid glucose. And these, over time, start to damage the nerves all through the body. And so by the time a person is about 40 or 50 years old, they start to develop problems. And the problems they start to develop are trouble walking, trouble with balance, stiffness in the legs, weakness in the legs, trouble with sensation, and a few other things. Sounding familiar? Okay, and these chunks of glucose that are in the nerves, they're called polyglucosan bodies. Okay. So now let me go back to the first part of my story. So we called Robert in, and I still remember us going into the surgical suite where a surgeon cut out a little bit of muscle and a little bit of nerve and gave them to my very anxious medical student who'd never seen anything like this before and was very careful not to drop anything. And rushed them to the lab. And we looked at the bits of nerve under the microscope, and we saw these chunks of glucose, these polyglucosan bodies. And we took the muscle to the lab, and we looked at the activity of the branching enzyme, and we saw it was less than half normal. And lastly, we did one more genetic test, and we found a change in the branching enzyme, which told us, in fact, that we had actually found Robert's diagnosis. And at that point, Robert became the first patient ever identified, to my knowledge, with adult polyglucosan body disease at UCLA. And unfortunately, I can't say that he was the last one, as I now have about half a dozen patients in my clinic with this problem. Which brings me to the third part of my story, which is where we go from here. And so now we know about this disease. We know how to identify it. So now we can identify it much, much better. So when I'm seeing patients, I can identify it now with a single blood test. It doesn't take as many years as it used to take. We can do it much quicker now. And knowing about the disease and knowing how to identify it is the first step, because from there we can then start to think about what to do next. And so the problem is, though we can find it, we still can't do a very good job yet of treating it or curing it. And that's really where everyone here comes in. And the first step is raising awareness, letting people know about this, because right now in the literature there's about 100 patients and families in the world that are known to have this disease, primarily in Israel, the United States, France, and the Netherlands. But there's many more, either who haven't been reported or have been misdiagnosed. And we need to find them, and we need to find better ways of treating them. And there's a lot of labs around the country that are working on this. And hopefully, the next time you guys hear me talk, I'll be able to say more about this and be able to say what we can actually do, not just what we know. Okay, so again, I started with a thank you. I want to close with a thank you. Say thank you again, Robert, for inviting me to be here. It's a pleasure to celebrate your work.